The misconception that bear cubs are inherently innocent or incapable of causing harm is widespread among many. Often there's an assumption that only adult bears are responsible for fatal encounters with humans. However, this belief can be dangerously misleading. Bear cubs, despite their youthful and seemingly innocent demeanor, possess the same biological instincts and protective behaviors as their adult counterparts. Hit that like button and subscribe right now. In today's episode, we go over 3 times bear cubs have been involved in a human fatality. Welcome to Final Affliction. Durango, nestled in the heart of Colorado State in western U.S., is a vibrant and bustling town surrounded by towering peaks and rolling hills that offer breathtaking vistas at every turn. Here, one can hike through the towering San Juan Mountains, kayak down the Animas River, or bike through the winding trails of its jagged countryside. The scent of pine trees fill the air as the crystal-clear streams and verdant meadows take away your breath. Laney Malavolta was a 39-year-old backcountry enthusiast who enjoyed being out in the woods. She and her boyfriend, Justin Wrangle, lived together in their home north of Durango town. The outdoors here provided an awe-inspiring scenery that Laney enjoyed exploring with family, friends, and her 2 dogs. On Friday, the 30th of April, 2021, Laney clocked out of the Republic National Distributing Company in Littleton, where she worked as a wine sales representative. She was feeling high in spirit as she looked forward to a fulfilling outdoor experience over the weekend. She was a fearless adventurer who loved nothing more than exploring the great outdoors. In the evening, Laney put on a sturdy pair of hiking boots, leashed her dogs, and set out on a peaceful walk with her 2 dogs by her side. She took a quiet, private trail near County Road 203 and Trimble Lane. The crisp evening breeze was scented with the fragrance of pine trees as the setting sun cast a golden glow over the landscape. Laney found solace in the quietness of the trail and the breathtaking panorama. The outdoors was her sanctuary, where she could escape the hustle and bustle of her job and reconnect with herself and with nature. The serene, winding trail passed through a wooded area near Whispering Pines Bible Camp. As they moved deeper into the trail, she could see the world fading away, leaving the 3 of them surrounded by the beauty of Durango's backcountry. It was a fleeting moment of pure contentment and tranquility in a world that can at times be overwhelming and chaotic. However, before she could wander further, her 2 dogs became alarmed, stood on their tracks, and their ears stood erect. They then began barking continuously while facing the woods. Something in the bushes had spooked them. Laney attentively scanned the woods, but she couldn't see anything. She knew that her dogs wouldn't just bark without cause, but she had no idea of what her dogs had sensed or seen. And then, just before the last light of the setting sun disappeared, something emerged from behind the woods. It was a female black bear with her 2 cubs in tow. They were coming straight at her and her dogs. The sight of the huge bear shook her to the core. She tried to move, but her knees were suddenly too weak. She stood frozen in terror as her dogs barked and yipped in fear while fleeing back down the trail, tails tucked between their legs, leaving Laney alone with the bear. At 8 p.m., Justin Wrangle, Laney's boyfriend, arrived home from work. He was working later than usual that day and had tried reaching Laney to let her know that he would be coming home late, but Laney was yet to respond. Immediately after parking his car, he noticed that something was odd. He noticed the lights in the house were off, and the dogs were out in the yard with their leashes still on. His girlfriend Laney was nowhere to be seen. He looked through all the corners of the house and even the shed outside, but still he couldn't find her. Knowing that she often took the dogs for a walk along the private trail, he dropped his luggage and set out, following the trail near the Whispering Pines Bible Camp to look for her. The sun had set hours ago, leaving the forest in pitch darkness. Justin searched the trail while calling out her name as the light from his flashlight cast eerie shadows on the trees. but the silence of the woods was the only response he received. As the minutes painfully went by, desperation crept in and his body began to fill with fear and worry. A sense of despair washed over him as he thought of all the things that could have happened to his dear girlfriend. He couldn't bear the thought of losing her. At 9:30 p.m., 1.5 hours after he began the search, his flashlight skimmed across the underbrush, and he caught a glimpse of human legs with familiar hiking boots still on. The legs were protruding from a lump covered in dirt and debris. He got closer to examine the horrific scene and lifted the twigs and leaves carefully, crossing his fingers that it was not his girlfriend lying there helplessly, and if it was, he hoped that she was still alive. As he lifted the last leaf off the face and shone his light on it, his heart sank and shattered into a million pieces. It was his girlfriend, Laney, lying motionless with her body partially eaten. Justin's hands were shaking as he grabbed his phone and dialed 911 to report the incident. Deep in his heart, he hoped that this was just a bad dream and that maybe, just maybe, Laney would wake up. As he slowly came to terms with reality, Justin sat next to her lifeless body in the pitch-black woods and wept uncontrollably. The thought of being alone in the dark trails no longer scared him. He felt as if his world had come to a sudden stop. Colorado Parks and Wildlife authorities promptly arrived at the scene and declared Laney dead. For the second time, Justin's worst fears had been confirmed. The authorities immediately suspected a cougar to have been the culprit, as these wild cats tend to bury their prey with leaves and dirt before returning to finish feeding on them later. However, the officers also found bear droppings and an abundance of bear fur at the scene, and they were now more convinced that the culprit was in fact a bear. A search team consisting of Colorado Parks and Wildlife officers with trained tracking dogs tracked and located the female black bear and her 2 cubs, who hadn't gone too far from the scene. As per the Colorado Parks and Wildlife's policy, when a bear attacks or consumes human remains, it has to be euthanized, and so the bear, along with her cubs, were put down. Relocation isn't considered a real option in these cases, due to fears that bears might return to their original location, having found a new food source in humans. A necropsy carried out by a state wildlife pathologist revealed human remains in the digestive systems of the sow and one of her cubs. The trio was in perfect health, with adequate fat stores and no signs of abnormality or disease that would have caused the attack. The sow weighed 204 pounds, while the cubs weighed 66 and 58 pounds. The officers stated that the 10-year-old mother bear was potentially teaching her cubs that humans are also a source of food and not creatures to avoid or fear. This, with no doubt, would make the cubs potential man-eaters as they aged. An autopsy on Laney revealed that she had passed on from blood loss due to perforations on her neck. The extensive damage had been inflicted by the sow after its sharp and long canines punctured her jugular vein and other regions on the neck. According to the coroner, the sow may have taken Laney down by clamping her powerful jaws on Laney's neck and throwing her back and forth before dropping her to the ground. The sow and one of her yearlings had then partially eaten the soft tissues on her face and arms. Both the autopsy results performed on Laney and the necropsy results from the bears confirmed Laney Malavolta's death was the result of a bear attack. Her family and friends were shaken to the core by her demise. They described her as an experienced and knowledgeable operator in the backcountry who spent her life in the outdoors. Her greatest joy was to be in the woods, and she wouldn't have wanted to exit the world in any other place, something that gave her loved ones some solace. As for Laney, she did nothing wrong to invoke the attack. She was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, sadly leading to her terrifying final affliction. When it comes to animals in the wild, it's well known that mothers will protect their young, no matter what. Whether it's a tiny frog to a huge lion, the females of these species will do everything they can to ensure that their young live and grow up to become proper adult animals. And, as the old adage goes, one of the scariest animals that you don't want to mess with is a mama bear and her cubs. David Montoya was an 18-year-old from Hollis in Oklahoma. As a young man, he had always been unsure as to what he wanted to do when he grew up. Whilst most of his friends in his school had an idea of what they wanted to do, David was slightly less sure about how he wanted to live his life. Despite this, he was a good student in school, getting good grades. However, he sometimes found it difficult to focus on his lessons. Instead, he wished that he was outside doing something practical. When it came time for his graduation, the young man had decided that he wanted to work with his hands, as he found it a lot more interesting than sitting in an office. Seeing that there was a job going for contractors at an Idaho-based company called Timberline Drilling, David decided to go and mine silver in Alaska, as he thought that it would be the perfect opportunity to get out of Oklahoma and go traveling, whilst also getting to earn a bit of money. The salaries of silver miners in the U.S. range from $30,880 to $70,360, but David was just excited to be finally out of school and making money. Being new to the job and probably one of the youngest on the job site, David knew that he would likely be earning the lower end of the average salary. However, for a young man just out of school, $30,000 a year was a good start. After securing the job, David packed his bags and flew out of Oklahoma, excited to start his job in Alaska. Once in Alaska, the young man was taken out to the drill site, which was so remote in its location that it was only accessible via helicopter. The drill site itself was located on the edge of the Hecla Greens Creek mine property, on an island in southeastern Alaska. For David, the whole experience was completely new and exhilarating. The wild landscape was something that he had never truly experienced before, especially not on the scale that Alaska boasts. The state has approximately 222 million acres of federal land, which is roughly about 60% of the state. Of that vast acreage, there are about 57.5 million acres of designated wilderness, along with some 16.5 million acres of proposed wilderness areas. Alaska's designated wilderness acreage makes up approximately 54% of the entire nation's wilderness. Considering just how much more wild the state was compared to Oklahoma, it was safe to say that David was feeling a little overwhelmed. However, the young man was determined to do well at his job. It was a very difficult and very physically demanding job, which left David feeling exhausted more often than not. But the young man enjoyed his work, and he felt that he was learning valuable life skills as he did it. Because Alaska is so wild, there are plenty of animals to be seen in the great outdoors, and one of these animals are bears. With more than 40,000 grizzly bears and 100,000 black bears roaming wild, it's not difficult at all to spot one of these amazing animals out and about. In fact, Admiralty Island is famous for its coastal grizzlies and has the densest population of bears per square mile in North America. An estimated 1,500 brown bears roam about on the island, according to the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, meaning that it is common to spot one without too much trouble tracking them down. Roughly 5 months after beginning his job as a silver miner, David had gotten into quite a good routine. He would wake up early, have his breakfast, and then head off to the drill site, where he would happily work, mining as much silver as he could. However, on this particular day, things didn't quite go according to plan. After working his morning shift, David was happy to finally go on break. Whilst he loved his job, it was still very exhausting, and taking a moment to relax and unwind in the fresh air was something that he always looked forward to. It was whilst the 18-year-old was wandering around the site, stretching his legs, that he stumbled across something he wished he hadn't. There, standing only a few feet in front of him, was a huge brown bear and her 2 cubs. Instantly, David froze in fear. When he had first began his job, he was made to go to a company meeting which discussed the mine's bear safety program. This included training that all workers, contractors, and visitors must complete before going to the site. Workers are taught ways to prevent bear encounters, including proper disposal of food. And, in remote locations, bear spray is among the tools employees generally bring with them in the case of bear encounters. Unfortunately for David, he had forgotten his bear spray. He also forgot the most important rule when dealing with a bear: not to make any sudden movements or noises. After noticing the bear, David quickly tried to backtrack. However, his panicked, fast movements scared the mama bear and her cubs, who thought that David was probably trying to threaten them. Not wanting her babies to get hurt, the mama grizzly rose up onto her back legs to try and make herself look more imposing before letting out a loud roar. Scared, David turned and tried to run. However, this set off the bear's hunting instinct. The huge bear charged after David, easily catching up to him as she could run as fast as 35 miles per hour. Once she had caught up to the young man, the mama grizzly began ferociously attacking him. She bit down where her teeth would reach and clawed relentlessly at his body. David was in utter agony, trying desperately to get away from the onslaught, but with a massive 600-pound bear on him, pinning him down, there was no way for him to escape. To make matters worse, the bear's cubs also ran over and began mauling David. They were learning from their mother, not understanding that attacking humans wasn't something that they should be doing. Sadly, despite David's efforts to get away, he was unable to escape the three bears. It wasn't long before one of the young man's co-workers went looking for David, as he was due back to work from his break. But when they found him, they couldn't believe their eyes. The mother bear and her two cubs were gathered around David's lifeless body, feasting on it, completely ignoring the men approaching them while they consumed David. Because they were in quite a wild place, a lot of the security at the mine site had guns. It was with these guns that the mama bear and her babies were euthanized. State troopers were then called to the island so that they could help sort out the situation. In the end, David's body was taken to the state medical examiner's office for an autopsy, where it was determined that the death was caused by the bears themselves. At first, David's co-workers were unsure if he had died from some kind of accident and the bears had found him already dead. The medical examiners were able to confirm he died of blood loss resulting from a bite to the neck. His body was then sent back to his home in Oklahoma so that his friends and family could give him a proper funeral. Everyone was devastated at the loss of David, as he was a well-liked young man who made friends with everyone he met. To make matters worse, he was only a week away from his 19th birthday when the attack took place. His family were left in shock, and they constantly miss him. However, whilst it is sad what happened to David, it is also sad how the attack was handled, with the mama bear and her two cubs being shot in retaliation for the attack. It is likely that the mama was simply trying to protect her babies from what she perceived to be danger. Others point to the three bears eating David's body to suggest the bears had mauled him as part of a predatory attack, possibly the mother bear teaching her cubs how to hunt, with the humans being the prey. If this was the case, if the bears hadn't been shot after the attack, it's likely they would have continued hunting humans, bringing more innocent people like David Montoya to their terrifying, final affliction. Amblipani Kohotra is a village located in the Dahod district in the southeast of India. It's one of those places that seems to have found a balance between the modern world and the old ways. Tribesmen in their traditional clothes walk the streets among the market stalls and cattle roaming free. Farmers still work and harvest from the land like their ancestors have done for thousands of years, and women stroll with baskets of produce balanced on their heads. The countryside is lush and wild, littered with jungle terrain, farmlands, and sanctuaries to keep the indigenous animals safe from poachers, as well as a convenient way for tourists to come and see them. Amblipani is nestled close to one of these sanctuaries, the Sloth Bear Reserve, set out to preserve the endangered Indian bear. The locals have all seen one of these magnificent animals at one point or another, and for the most part, the people stay as far away as possible from these animals. They are by nature aggressive animals, unlike their black and grizzly cousins who will avoid people unless protecting their young. or scared. They prefer to be left to their own devices, something that the people of Dahod are more than happy to give them. December in India is a quiet time in nature. This is usually when mothering animals retreat into the overgrowth to spend the last few months with their young before setting them off by themselves when spring arrives. Also, there is more food the farther away from people they move. And given that this is the dry time of the year, the animals only come out when food is at its scarcest. And that seems to be the case for a mother sloth bear and her cub. She'd had her pair of cubs 2 months ago, but the smaller of the two had already died. It was much weaker than its sibling, and the scarce winter foliage and the struggle of fighting its larger and stronger brother for milk had just been too much for the young cub. The female was incredibly protective of her only remaining offspring. She didn't much like going so close to the human settlements, but that's where the food led her to go, and she needed to feed herself and her cub if they were going to see the new growth in spring. On that day in 2021, the bear and her cub on her back were rooting for termites and bugs among the hollows of tree roots. That morning, Sanjali Rathwa was also looking for food, but not for herself. The 42-year-old needed to get her cattle out to graze as early as she could. Even in winter, India is still warm, albeit dry. Sanjali led the herd into the canopy of the trees before the sun could get high, and they could at least find some shade while her animals ate to their heart's content. Sanjali genuinely enjoyed the quiet and stillness of the wilderness, with only the sounds of birds and the crunch of hooves to break the silence. The first 3 hours went as expected, and Sanjali even found a spot to rest underneath a tree for a good hour before the herd started moving deeper into the bush. She sighed, but decided that there were plenty of other places to keep herself company with her own thoughts, wherever else the cows decided to graze, and set off after them. The sloth bear, with her cub still riding on her back, became acutely aware of the approaching herd of bovines. She yipped at her baby to keep him quiet and made her way up the nearest tree to safety. It was best to wait until the creatures passed before she got back on the ground. But to her already vexed agitation, the cows settled right around the tree she was hiding in. It was not a very high vantage point, barely 2 meters tall, and she didn't feel especially well hidden. Intermingled with the smell of herbivores, there was another scent, a human scent, that she didn't like at all. Humans were loud and dangerous. She avoided them at all costs, especially now that she had a young one to take care of. And to the bear's great unease, the human walking behind the herd started walking over to the very tree she was hidden in. Minutes dragged by, the woman below in the shade, completely unaware of the animals above her. The mother sloth bear and her cub were so camouflaged that they practically disappeared into the foliage above. The cub's long weight on its mother's back, with only her breathing to lull it into a stupor, slowly drifted off to sleep. Its claws relaxed, and before the mother could stop him, he went tumbling through the branches. The black cub, which resembled a small dog more than a bear, landed with a thump on Sanjali's crossed legs. She let out a startled yell when the flailing baby bear landed on her. Her shout set several things in motion all at once. A flock of birds shot into the air. Her herd of cows took off running in fright, and the mother bear above Sanjali's head let out a roar of panic and anger. She leapt off the branches just as the woman looked up at the sound from above, and landed with her full 200-pound weight on top of Sanjali's head, claws already outstretched. Her nails dug into Sanjali's neck and cheeks, tearing and ripping at every inch of her that they could reach in a frenzied attack. The woman was crushed beneath the immense weight of the fully grown bear, and she could only try to grab hold of the thick and coarse fur in an attempt to get it off of her. But it was of no use. Sanjali, weighing only 120 pounds at most, was no match for the mother in full protection mode. The claws on her neck yanked away, tearing out a large chunk of muscle and skin. The arterial spray that evacuated the wound coated Sanjali, the bear, and the tree in bright red blood. The animal rolled off, got its feet under it again, and went after the screaming woman once more. Sanjali's hands went to her throat the moment the weight was off her, trying desperately to stem the torrent of blood. On her knees, she attempted to get up to run, but she'd lost so much blood so quickly that her knees promptly gave in on her. And then the creature was on top of her again, her jaws closing over Sanjali's whole face. Her teeth sank into Sanjali's skull and under her jaw. The animal shook Sanjali like she weighed nothing, and Sanjali was already too weakened from her injuries to pose any resistance. Her limbs flayed with the force, and her body was limp. The bear shook her a second time and realized that the human had stopped moving. She released Sanjali's head, and the woman lay lifelessly on the ground. A sniff was enough to assure the mother bear that the human was no longer a threat. So she left Sanjali there to bleed to death under the tree and to find her cub, which had stayed hidden behind a large boulder nearby. She decided it was safer to live off less food in the deep jungle after all, and the pair trotted into the foliage, never to be seen again. The day wore on, with no one in the village having any idea of the horrendous tragedy that had occurred to their neighbor. It was only when the small herd of cattle, driven by schedule and the knowledge of where their shelter was, came walking back into town that the people realized that something was very, very wrong indeed. Their handler was not with the cows, and they set out to look for her, hoping that she'd taken a fall or maybe fainted in the heat of the day. But by nightfall, after not finding any trace of Sanjali, the authorities were called in to assist in the search. While the village took care of her worried children, the night dragged on. It wasn't until the next morning that Sanjali's remains were finally found. She'd been almost completely scalped from her jaw to the base of her neck, and what was left of her neck was nothing but a raw, shredded open wound. Authorities could at least determine what had attacked her, and that her death had been relatively quick. The sloth bear's first clawing had severed the jugular and main arteries. Sanjali had lost consciousness before the rest of her scalping had occurred in the second wave of the attack. There was a funeral paid for by the state and attended by everyone in the village, old and young. The only sloth bear attack of 2021 in India was a fatality, and the victim was a mother, a sister, and a beloved resident of her community, who unfortunately met her terrifying final affliction.